Cleopatra was a woman of much intrigue, and today we're discussing her family, her origins, her death, and more. After all the stuff about hiding in carpets, bathing in milk, and being bitten by snakes, more on that later. The most famous thing associated with Cleopatra, who was born around 69 BCE, is Egypt. Yes, the ethnicity of Cleopatra, the last active Hellenistic ruler of the Macedonian-led Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, has caused a lot of debate in some very popular circles. There is a general consensus among scholars that she was predominantly of Macedonian Greek ancestry and minorly of Iranian descent. Others, including some very prominent scholars and laymen, have speculated whether she may have had additional ancestries. Cleopatra's official coinage, which she would have approved, and the 3 portrait busts of her considered authentic by scholars, which match said coins, portray Cleopatra as a Greek woman in style. Although one of the more popular busts is now largely considered by scholars to be that of her daughter, Cleopatra Selene II. A popular expert, Francisco Pinapolo, writes that Cleopatra's coinage presents her image with certainty and asserts that the sculpted portrait of the Berlin Cleopatra's head is confirmed as having a similar profile. Roman frescoes in Pompeii and other places similar to the Vatican and Berlin, well, those marble sculptures, have been identified as possible portraits of the queen based on comparable facial features and royal iconography. Pretty neat. So if, like me, you don't really enjoy having to type out the word Ptolemy, seeing as your computer or your phone keeps trying to say potato, then you're in for a bad time, because there's a lot of Ptolemies about to happen. So the first one was Cleopatra's younger brother, the 13th. So after her dad died, she was put in charge. But at the time, you needed a co-ruler. Doesn't matter if you're a guy or a gal, there needed to be 2 people on the throne. So the easiest solution was just for her to get married to, well, her little brother. And they were gonna reign Egypt together, which, like, I guess is kind of odd when you look at it through a modern lens, but it was mostly just a symbolic marriage for the sake of upholding the tradition of having both a male and female ruler on the throne at the same time. Still, you couldn't convince me to marry my little brother. So these rulers may have been warmongering and brutal, but they loved their books. In Alexandria, which was Egypt's capital at the time, an incredible library housed original works written from around the world. Young Cleopatra spent her upbringing studying. She became a scholar, she was a scientist, and she was a gifted chemist. She did a lot of experimenting with poisons. And it's known that she spent a lot of time in some kind of ancient laboratory. That's where she conducted a lot of research on herbs and cosmetics. Sadly, everything she wrote was kind of lost in this big fire in 391. You know, just that little fire where the Great Library of Alexandria was completely destroyed. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages. She was the first ruler to speak Egyptian, and apart from that, she knew ancient Greek, the languages of the Parthians, the Ethiopians, and so much more. So all those knowledge and language skills were really put to use as a good ruler of Egypt. So at the height of her power, about 2,000 years ago, Cleopatra's empire stretched across the Mediterranean, from modern-day Libya in the west, through Egypt to Syria in the east, and it was the largest amount of territory any woman has ever ruled. She was the absolute ruler over 7 million people and the richest woman in the world, worth 95.8 billion with a B dollars in today's currency. She was probably the richest person in her time. Roman propaganda painted Cleopatra as a debauched temptress who used her physical appeal as a political weapon, but she may have been more renowned for her intellect than her appearance. Egyptian sources later described her as a ruler who elevated the ranks of scholars and enjoyed their company. There's also evidence that Cleopatra wasn't as physically striking as once believed. Coins with her portrait show her with manly features and a large hooked nose, although some historians think that maybe she intentionally portrayed herself as masculine as a display of strength. For his part, the ancient writer Plutarch claimed that Cleopatra's beauty was not altogether incomparable, and that it was instead her amazing speaking voice and irresistible charms that made her so desirable. Power grabs and plots to kill were as much a family tradition as was interfamily marriage, and Cleopatra and her brothers and sisters were no different. So her first sibling husband ran her out of Egypt after she tried to take sole possession of the throne, and the pair later faced off in a civil war. Cleopatra regained the upper hand by teaming with Julius Caesar, and then somebody perished in the Nile River after being defeated in battle. So after this war, Cleopatra remarried to her younger brother, but she is believed to have had him killed in a bid to make her son the co-ruler. Also in 41 BC, she engineered the killing of her sister, who she considered a rival to the throne. Well, if you don't like your siblings, that's one way to get rid of them. Cleopatra believed herself to be a living goddess, and she often used very clever stagecraft to woo potential allies and reinforce her divine status. A famous example of her flair for the dramatic came in 48 48 BC, when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria during her feud with Ptolemy XIII. Knowing his forces would kind of thwart her attempts to meet with the Roman general, Cleopatra had herself wrapped in a carpet. Some sources say it was a linen sack, and smuggled into his personal quarters. Well, Caesar was dazzled by the sight of the young queen in her royal garb, and the two soon became allies and lovers. Cleopatra later employed a similar bit of theater in her 41 BC encounter with Mark Antony. When summoned to meet, she is said to have arrived on a golden barge adorned with purple sails and rowed by oars made of silver. She had been made up to look like the goddess Aphrodite, and she sat beneath a gilded canopy while attendants dressed as cupids fanned her and burned very sweet-smelling incense. Well, Antony, who considered himself the embodiment of the Greek god Dionysius, was instantly enchanted. Cleopatra's later relationship with Mark, by the way, who was second in command to Caesar, was immortalized by Shakespeare in the very famous play Antony and Cleopatra. This was one of the most legendary and tragic love affairs in history, but it also primarily served a political purpose. So Egypt may have enjoyed great wealth and resources, but after Caesar's planned death, Cleopatra knew that her kingdom was still at the whim of Rome, the reigning superpower. So Cleopatra was well aware that in order for Egypt to remain independent at all, it needed a very powerful protector. Well, Caesar's death had left a power vacuum in Rome, and two prominent men, Caesar's chosen heir and nephew Octavian, and Antony, the ambitious politician in general, were having quite the fight to fill it. Octavian had the financial backing of the Senate, but Antony desperately needed money to pay his troops. Once again, Cleopatra saw an in. Writing of the first meeting between Antony and Cleopatra, there's a picture painted of an older, wiser Cleopatra, intent on winning her prize. Caesar's acquaintance was with her when a girl, young and ignorant of the world, but she was to meet Antony in the time of her life when woman's beauty is most splendid, and their intellects are in full maturity. She made great preparation for her journey, of money, gifts, and ornaments of value, such as so wealthy a kingdom might afford, but she brought with her her surest hopes in her own magic, arts, and charms. Well, she didn't need magic. Experts say that Antony needed money, and Cleopatra was the richest woman in the world. So in exchange for her financial support, Antony became Egypt's ally and defender against Roman encroachment, and gave Cleopatra, whom he eventually married, 3 more heirs. The real-life double ending of Antony and Cleopatra, as recorded by famed historians, provided a suitable tragic ending to Shakespeare's play, but it probably didn't go down exactly as Shakespeare wrote it. So Antony, falsely believing Cleopatra to be dead after a failed sea battle against Octavian, falls on his own sword and eventually dies in her arms from the wound. Well, Cleopatra, not willing to be paraded in the streets of Rome as a prisoner of war, has a poisonous snake smuggled into her quarters. In the final scene of the play, she hugs the snake to her chest and, Well, in the real-life written version, the snake is hidden in a basket of large figs. Apparently, this was brought with the leaves hidden beneath them because Cleopatra had given orders that the reptile might fasten itself upon her body without her being aware of it. But then she took away some of the figs, she saw it, she said, "There it is, you see," and she held her arm out for the poison. But even famed historical writers admit there are various accounts of Cleopatra's death, and that the truth of the matter no one knows. For it was also said that she carried about poison in a hollow comb and kept the comb hidden in her hair. Modern Cleopatra scholars say that the poison would have been a much simpler and faster way to go, but Cleopatra likely included the more dramatic snake story in her final note to Caesar. After Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, and Octavian was later known as Caesar Augustus, Emperor of Rome. Finally for today, so we all know that Cleopatra first began her legendary love affair with Mark Antony in 41 BC. The relationship was very political. Cleopatra needed him to protect her crown and maintain Egypt's independence, and he needed access to Egypt's riches and resources. But like they were actually famously fond of each other's company. Well, according to ancient sources, they spent the entire winter of 41 to 40 BC living a life of leisure and excess in Egypt, and even formed their own drinking society, known as the Inimitable Livers. The group engaged in nightly feasts and wine binges, and its members occasionally took part in elaborate games and contests. One of the duo's favorite activities supposedly involved wandering the streets of Alexandria in disguise and playing pranks on its residents. Well, that's all folks. I've been Alexa. See ya!